Our midnight study period, midnight Bible study period. Yeah, our midweek Bible study period. We appreciate the presence of each and every one. We have two more sessions in our summer series as we study Brother Winkler's book, The Church We Love. And Chris Hicks will be speaking tonight. We've really enjoyed the series. I've got most of them in, and this time with my meeting schedule being heavy in the spring, and I've really enjoyed them. I won't get to be here next week. We'll be speaking at Crossville for their summer series, but I believe that, well, I'll just wait. And Matthew Jones teaches the last session next week, Lord willing. I did want to mention, I did not know about it till just a day or two ago, about Tyrone Pointer having a severe heart attack, and many of us know him, and he's neighbors to some of us, and I always call him Terrible Tyrone, because every time you ask him how he's doing, he says terrible. Well, he got sick on the way to KFC. A lot of us see him over there on Sunday, and had a heart attack 2 weeks ago, I believe, Sunday. But anyway, we knew him from Tyrone's Cleaners, or Pointer's Cleaners, and Flower Shop too. He and his mom worked there for a long time. So they have requested our prayers, and we need to remember them. Whoever leads the prayer tonight. Thank you for being here. Brother Barry, I did tell him your song. 495. 495. Following this, we'll ask Josh for a lead us in our opening prayer. Oh, the depth and the riches of God's saving grace, flowing down from the cross for me. The debt for my sins by the Savior was paid, and His suffering on Calvary. Oh, the depth of such wonderful love, flowing boundless and full and free. And the debt for my sins was all paid, and suffering on Calvary. Oh, what marvelous mercy, what infinite love, what immeasurable grace I see. By His blood I am cleansed, I am happy and free, through His suffering on Calvary. Oh, the depth of such wonderful love, flowing boundless and full and free. And the debt for my sins was all paid, and His suffering on Calvary.
Most gracious and loving Heavenly Father, we're so thankful for another day of life that you bless us with, and we're thankful for all the many blessings and abilities that you give us each day that we sometimes take for granted. We're thankful for this spirit of worship service that we are able to participate in tonight, Heavenly Father. We pray that you be with Brother Chris as he delivers the lesson unto us, and be with all the teachers downstairs and the children in their classes, and pray that each of us will open up our ears and take from it the things that we're focusing upon tonight, Heavenly Father. At the time of our lives, we pray that we be better Christians in thy sight. We are mindful of those that may not be in good enough health to make it out to the services tonight, Heavenly Father. We want to ask a special blessing upon Mr. Tyrone that was mentioned for the illness that he's kind of come into. We pray that you will be with each of those that are suffering right now, Heavenly Father. Give them back a portion of their health as they stand in need of. Go with us throughout the remainder of this service, and pray that everything that's said and done is in accordance with thy will. This we humbly pray in your Son, Jesus' name. Amen.
Up here. Is that coming through? Sounds like it is. Appreciate you all being here for our Wednesday night Bible study. Somehow wound up. I had the lesson Sunday morning, and then tonight, Sunday morning, we studied Exodus. Tonight, we're looking at Acts. And today, I spoke at the Chamber of Commerce about pasture weeds. So I guess if I get confused and start talking about Exodus, it's probably not a big deal. But if I start talking about broom sedge and thistles, somebody throws something at me so we get back on track. But we are supposed to be talking about Acts tonight. We've been talking about the church we love, and tonight's lesson is giants in the shadows of the church we love. When Amanda and I worshiped at Knoxville, when we lived up there, we went to Carnes, there was a series of lessons delivered with the title Lost in the Credits. And it was a different character each night that the preacher described as being lost in the credits. And he based that off of the credits at the end of a movie. If you watch a movie, most people leave when the credits start to roll, but if you've ever watched them, you'd probably noticed that the first few people in the credits are people you've probably heard of, Brad Pitt or Jennifer Aniston or whoever the movie star is. And as you go through the credits, you start to see people that aren't as famous, people that you maybe don't recognize, or people you've never heard of, and eventually they get to the lights and the sound and the camera people, and those people that are important. The movie wouldn't be the same without them, but they're not necessarily famous. They're not necessarily as well known. They're kind of lost in the credits. And so he's talked about in those lessons people in the Bible who were lost in the credits, people that you might hear their name mentioned, not even recognize that they were somebody in the Bible. We talked about a couple of those Sunday morning in our study, I think, in the book of Acts, when we talked about Shiphrah and Puah, those two ladies in Exodus chapter 1 that were maidservants, that the Pharaoh came to them and said, when a baby's born, if it's a male child, you kill that child. Because he was afraid of the Israelites' growing population, so he ordered those two ladies to kill those male children. And those two women feared God and refused to follow those orders. And those two ladies might be kind of lost in the credits to us. We may not remember their names, but they're very important. And we pointed out Sunday that their names are recorded in the Bible forever. And the name of Pharaoh is not. And I think that's a powerful testament to those two women. Now tonight we're talking about not necessarily people that are lost in the credits, but people that are kind of in the shadows. They're not, we know who they are. We recognize their names, but they're not as famous as maybe the main stars in the book of Acts. They're not Peter. They're not Paul. And there's individuals like this throughout the Scriptures. If you talk about Moses, well, Moses is probably the star of Exodus and the following books. But where would Moses have been without Aaron? God sent Aaron to be a spokesperson for Moses. And without Aaron, Moses wouldn't have been nearly as effective as he was. Maybe Aaron was kind of in the shadows of Moses, but he was still very important. King David, we would recognize King David as being one of the stars of the Old Testament, but where would David have been without Jonathan? Probably dead without Jonathan. Now, even though Jonathan's kind of in those shadows of David, he was still very important. And we're going to look at 5 individuals in the book of Acts who were very important to the early church, and specifically, they were very important to Paul. Paul's life was changed by each of these individuals that we're going to talk about. We recognize Paul as being the star, maybe, of the book of Acts. Jesus is really the star, but as far as in an earthly, human kind of sense, Paul would be one of the stars in the book of Acts. And these people are maybe in his shadow, but he wouldn't have been who he was without these individuals. So they're, in that sense, they're giants. They're giants who lived in the shadows, but were very important in the early church. And as we talk about this, I think the main thing that we want to get out of the lesson is that all of us have a role. Everybody's important. Not everybody is the preacher, not everybody is an elder, but everybody has a role in the church. Jesus said in Matthew 23, "He who is greatest among you must be" what? Servant. A servant. And these individuals were servants. And they had that spirit, and I think as an example to us, they stand out. So let's look at these 5, and we'll go fairly briefly as Probably won't go as in-depth as maybe we would like to for time's sake, but let's go through them and see if we can learn some things. And for sure, if you have a comment, I hope you'll feel comfortable speaking up. If I don't see you, just yell out. The first one is Ananias. Ananias, who baptized Saul. Here's a giant who lived in the shadows of Paul, but was really important. 3 individuals in the book of Acts have the name Ananias. Can you remember any of them besides the one that baptized Paul? There was the Ananias who was married to Sapphira. Those two are kind of thought of as, together we talk about Ananias and Sapphira. That's not who we're talking about. Of course, those are the ones that they took credit for being generous when they weren't really as generous as they made out to be, and ultimately paid the price with their life. Who was the other Ananias? The high priest. The high priest that ordered that Paul be struck in the mouth. Not a very good individual, not a very kind, compassionate leader, but his name was Ananias. The Ananias we're looking at, you can read about in Acts chapter 9 or Acts chapter 22. We're going to look at Acts chapter 9. He baptized Saul of Tarsus. Now, if you read 1 Corinthians, Paul kind of warns against putting too much stock, I guess, in who baptized you. Evidently, the Corinthian brethren were saying that they were of Paul, or they were of Cephas, or they were of Apollos because that's who baptized them. And Paul warned against that, to not do that, because he said, basically, did any of us die for you? No, it was Christ that died for you. He's the one that should be the focus. But even though we shouldn't put too much emphasis on who we were baptized by, probably every one of us remembers who baptized us. They were somebody who was important to us. They were somebody who had an influence on our life. They were maybe the person who taught us the gospel. They probably weren't just some random person. They meant something to us, and the fact that they baptized us is special to us. It means something. The fact that Ananias baptized Saul, I'm sure, meant something to him, but maybe even more so because of the courage that it took to baptize this person. Because when you first meet Saul, what's he doing? Absolutely, he's persecuting the church. The first time we read about him is when Stephen was stoned, and they threw their clothes, or laid their clothes at the feet of Saul. And in the first verse, I think it is, of the next chapter, it says that Saul was consenting to their death. So he didn't just watch this, he was all about it. He thought this was a great thing that Stephen was being stoned to death. And his mission when he went to Damascus was to persecute Christians. To persecute Christians and imprison people just like Ananias. And so when the Lord came to Ananias in chapter 9 and said, I want you to go and you're going to meet this guy named Saul. I want you to talk to him. Ananias' response was probably very similar to what ours was. What was his response? Was he really excited about it? No, he was afraid. If you look at verse 13 of Acts 9, he said, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, how much harm he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and here he has authority from the chief priest to bind all who call on your name. Ananias had heard of this guy. He knew why he was coming to Damascus, and it was to arrest people just like him. And so he went to the Lord and said, I'm not so sure about this. And I think probably most of us would have had that same reaction. But Jesus continued and said, Go, for he is a chosen vessel of mine to bear my name before Gentiles, kings, and the children of Israel, for I will show him how many things he must suffer for my name's sake. And look at the first 3 words of verse 17 of Acts chapter 9. And Ananias went. God said go, or Jesus said go, and Ananias went. And I read that, and I think of Mark 16:15. What does Mark 16:15 say? Go. It says go. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Jesus said go. Ananias went. Jesus told me to go. And what? Jesus told all of us to go. And what? Do we go? Do we do what God expects of us? Even when we're afraid, even if we're scared like Ananias. And when you think of it in that context, I think it's a pretty thought-provoking question to say, hey, he said go and this guy went and he was afraid and he was scared. Do I have that same courage to go even if I'm not sure, even if I'm maybe not as confident, even if I'm a little afraid? Do I have the courage to go the way that Ananias did? And so Ananias, we don't know a lot about him other than the fact that he baptized Paul. But this otherwise unknown preacher baptized one of the greatest missionaries the world has ever seen. It took courage to do so. And so I think he stands as a good example to us, as a giant who really shouldn't be in the shadows. He needs to be out of the shadows because he should be considered one of the stars of the book of Acts. Any other comments on Ananias? Well, let's look at our second character. We had Ananias who baptized Saul. Let's look at Barnabas who believed in Saul. Saul becomes a Christian. Okay, Ananias baptizes Saul. He becomes a Christian, and everything's lovely, right? His life is now perfect. Everybody has forgotten about his past transgressions. Sometimes if we're not careful, we can leave that impression on people, can't we? If we're talking to them about the gospel, we can leave people with the impression that once you become baptized, once you become a Christian, all your problems go away and all the bad things you did, everybody's going to forget about them. Well, God forgets about them, but do human beings forget about them? No, they don't. They remember. And the people that Saul ran into, even in the church, remembered who he was and what he had done. If you continue in Acts chapter 9 and look down in verse 26, Luke says, "And when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him and did not believe that he was a disciple." It's pretty easy to criticize that. Pretty easy to look at those disciples and say, shame on those disciples. Because we know the rest of the story. We know that Saul truly was converted, that he really was a changed man. We know what he was capable of because we know what he eventually did and the tremendous amount of work that he did for the Lord. But if I'm honest with you, I'm probably a lot like those disciples. Because if I'm being honest with you, and there was somebody in Tennessee that had been all over the news because he had done all kinds of terrible things, specifically targeting members of the Lord's church, and had just been really, really evil in his persecution of Christians. And all of a sudden he walked through those doors on Sunday morning or on Wednesday night and said, I'm here to worship. I probably wouldn't be a lot different than those disciples. I would probably be very skeptical of that person, if I'm being honest. That probably shouldn't be the attitude that we have, but that's probably a little bit human nature. They probably thought, well, maybe he's coming in to kind of sneak in and infiltrate the local church here in Jerusalem. That way he can see who are the disciples, who are these people who are following Christ, because that would make it that much easier to target those people and to persecute those people. And so they were skeptical. They didn't really receive Saul, this newly converted Christian. But then you look at the next verse. Just like with Ananias, you look at the next verse, the first two words, but Barnabas. That shows a contrast, doesn't it? The disciples didn't receive Saul, but Barnabas took him and brought him to the apostles, and he declared to them how he had seen the Lord on the road and how he had spoken to him and how he had preached boldly at Damascus in the name of Jesus. The contrast between Barnabas and these other disciples is pretty stark. And Barnabas had been nicknamed Barnabas by the apostles back in Acts chapter 4. If you look back in Acts 4, about 36, it says, "And Joseph," and some texts may say Joseph, "who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which is translated son of encouragement, a Levite of the country of Cyprus, having land, sold it, and brought the money and laid it at the apostles' feet." he was the one that sold the land, and that made Ananias and Sapphira have that idea that they would sell some land and take credit for giving more than they actually gave. But anyway, he was nicknamed something that meant son of encouragement by the apostles. So if you think about that, I was thinking about it and I thought, well, what if the people who knew us best nicknamed us? You know, nicknamed us some name that had a deeper meaning about who we were. Because Barnabas, that wasn't his given name that his mother gave him. The apostles gave him that name because he was evidently somebody that this wasn't a one-time deal for. He was known for encouraging other people, and they gave him that name. And it's kind of thought-provoking to think, well, what if people nicknamed me something? What would that nickname be? Might not be as good as son of encouragement. I might not be as nice and polite as that, but it's something to think about because that's what Barnabas was. And he continued to live up to that nickname. If you look in chapter 11, beginning in verse 23, Luke said, when he came and had seen the grace of God, he was glad and encouraged them all with purpose of heart that they should continue with the Lord. For he was a good man, just talking about Barnabas, full of the Holy Spirit and of faith, and a great many people were added to the Lord. So people were saved from their sins because of the work of this good man and the attitude that he brought to the church in Antioch. And he continued in verse 25 to seek out. He says he sought Saul, and when he had found him, he brought him to Antioch. So it was that for a whole year they assembled with the church and taught a great many people, and the disciples were first called Christians in Antioch. And normally we read that verse and we focus on that last part, but this text is really about Barnabas and his mentorship of this young convert named Saul. And then you think about all the great things that Saul did once he became Paul, all the people that he saved and the mission trips, and he continues to influence us even today. And we put his name up there, and rightfully so, but I don't know that he would have been nearly as successful as he was without the encouragement of this church leader named Barnabas. I'm going to take a breath and let y'all add to what little I've said. No comments. Well, either you're asleep or you just don't have anything to say. We'll continue then. Let's look at a third person. And this is actually two people, but they're together so often they're thought of as one. Let's talk about Aquila and Priscilla, who shared their home and hearts with Paul. Aquila and Priscilla are mentioned 6 times in the New Testament, and you never read one without the other. You never read about one what you don't read about the other. And probably all of us have known couples that when you thought of one, you thought of the other. You know, we think of Jerry, we think of Mary. And there's plenty of other couples in the church that we could talk about. We think of one of them, you think of both. Sometimes it's interesting. Sometimes Aquila's mentioned first. Sometimes Priscilla's mentioned first. But they're always mentioned together. And if you turn to Acts 18, we'll read a little bit about what they did. And what they did wasn't, earth-shattering. It wasn't some huge grand gesture. But it was impactful enough that Luke deemed it necessary to write about it. Beginning in verse 1 of Acts 18, it says, after these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and persuaded both Jews and Greeks. So verse 3, because he was of the same trade, so they were both tent makers, he stayed with them and worked. So all they did, seems to me, is they opened up their home to Paul. They gave him a place to stay. They gave him a place to lay down and rest. And pretty simple, right? Not this earth-shattering grand gesture. but they were just hospitable. They showed hospitality. And they did more that we don't necessarily know about. If you look in Romans chapter 16, beginning in verse 3, Paul said, "Greet Priscilla and Aquila, my fellow workers in Christ Jesus, who risked their own necks for my life, to whom not only I give thanks, but also all the churches of the Gentiles." Now, some of you may know what that means by that they risked their lives, other than I assume that it meant, they risked their necks, they risked their life, but I don't know exactly how they risked their life. Maybe just having them in their home was a risk to them. I don't know. But these people left an impression upon Paul, and it seems that most of it was just due to what we'd call Southern hospitality. I guess it wasn't Southern, but it was hospitality that they showed towards Paul. And Brother Edward mentioned also another instance in the lives of this Christian couple. In Acts chapter 18, he mentioned this on Sunday involving Apollos. Remember when Apollos was teaching false doctrine, not on purpose, just out of ignorance, because he didn't know anything past the baptism of John, according to verse 25 of Acts 18. And so in verse 26, he began to speak boldly in the synagogue. When Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. And I think that's really impressive, but what's as impressive as what they did is what they didn't do, right? They didn't ignore it. Here's a young, well-spoken preacher who's preaching something that isn't right, and they could have ignored it and said, well, I don't want to rock the boat, I don't want to upset this young preacher, I don't want to cause a scene, and they could have just let it ride. But they didn't do that. Or they could have gone to the other extreme and really embarrassed this guy. I mean, they could have really publicly humiliated and just berated Apollos because of the mistake that he had made, and they didn't do that either. They were gentle and just explained to him what he had done wrong and what he needed to do, and that's very impressive. Our regional director, we had a meeting here in one of the many meetings that I get to go to. But this was actually useful because he gave us a piece of paper, and on that piece of paper it said at the top, things that don't require talent. Now, he gave it to everybody, not just me. Okay, so he wasn't just picking on me for not having talent, he was picking on everybody. But he gave us all this sheet of paper that says things that don't require talent. And it had things like being positive, having a good attitude, being honest, showing up on time. It's things that, just what it says, don't necessarily require any great skills, but if you do those things, you're going to be probably more effective at whatever your job is than 90% of the other people, including those who have more talent than you do. And that was his point. And when I think about Barnabas, Aquila, and Priscilla, they were talented people, don't get me wrong, but the things that they did that really made an impression in people's lives didn't require that much talent. I mean, how much talent does it take to open up your home to somebody and say, hey, you're coming through this way, come stay with us for a few days? It doesn't require talent. I mean, if you're Barnabas, how much talent did it take to encourage somebody? Say something nice to encourage other people. That doesn't take a lot of talent. And yet they did it, and others could have done it, but they didn't do it. So sometimes we get hung up on what we can't do. I'm not as good at this as somebody else, or I can't do that. And a lot of times we don't give ourselves enough credit because we probably could do that thing that we think we can't do if we would just try. But even if we're not talented, which is not true of any of us, we can do some things. We can encourage people. We can be hospitable to people. We can teach people the way that Aquila and Priscilla did. And so they used their talents, but they also did things that, to me, didn't require any extra talent and really didn't require that much work if you look at it. But it was special because they did it and others could have done it, but just didn't. All right.
You see this
Yes.
And then Paul wouldn't have named them in the letter to Rome unless they'd gone back there. So they had to move around.
And it probably would have been easy when they had been run out of Rome to just have this woe is me attitude. I've been run out of my home and had to move somewhere else, but that doesn't seem to be their attitude. They went to work. Thank you, Johnny. Let's talk about our fourth individual, our fourth giant in the shadows. We've already alluded to him, Apollos. Apollos, the man who succeeded Paul. And until I read this lesson, I never really thought about Apollos succeeding Paul, but I guess in a way he did, at least at Corinth, because if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul said about the church at Corinth, I planted, Apollos watered, God gave the increase. So Paul started the church at Corinth, but he wasn't there to see it grow, to see it flourish. It was Apollos who was there watering and continuing the work that Paul had started. Apollos is described when we are introduced to him in chapter 18, verse 24. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born in Alexandria. That born in Alexandria, you just read right past that, but I think that's there for a reason, because Alexandria was known as this cultural center of the area, as being a place of learning. It had this enormous library, so people from Alexandria were probably thought of as being well educated and very intelligent, and I'm sure Apollos was. He was also an eloquent man, according to verse 24, and mighty in the Scriptures, but he wasn't perfect. Even though he was well learned and knowledgeable, we already mentioned that he was speaking some things because out of ignorance. He only knew the baptism of John, and he was willing to listen to these tent makers who came and talked to him and explained the truth more perfectly. Now, I think that says something about Apollos, because he was from Alexandria, and he could have easily said, well, I'm from Alexandria. I think I know a little bit more than these tent makers, but that wasn't his attitude. He was willing to learn from anyone, and again, completed the work that Paul had started. You can read more about that at the end there, verse of chapter 18. But he did follow, which is a reminder to us, whoever we are, whatever we're doing in the church, we need to make sure somebody else at some point is trained on how to do that. That eventually all of us are going to, we're going to die. That's just a sad way to say it. I know that's very blunt. Probably you've thought about that before. Probably not the first person to stand up here and tell you that. We're going to die. And so somebody else needs to know how to do what we do. And so they need to be trained on it. Paul let Apollos do the work and succeed him and continue the work that he had started. And on the other hand, not only do those who are older have to train those who are younger on how to do certain things, those that are younger have to be willing to be trained. And Apollos apparently was. Let's look at our last person as we run out of time here. We have Luke, who walked with Paul. As you read the book of Acts, you'll notice personal pronouns. We, us, our. If you look especially at chapter 16, chapter 20, chapter 27, you'll see those pronouns because Luke was right there with Paul on a lot of these trips. We think of Paul as going, but Luke was apparently right there with him. And in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 14, I want to point something out to you as we wrap up. Paul said, Luke, the beloved physician, and Demas greet you. Luke and Demas greet you. Why would I bring that up? Well, I bring that up because Luke was with him. He was faithful to him. At that point, Demas was with him, was faithful to him. In 2 Timothy chapter 4, what you'll recognize as being the last chapter that we have that Paul wrote, he says in verse 9, be diligent to come to me quickly, for Demas, in verse 10, has forsaken me, having loved this present world, and has departed for Thessalonica. And in verse 11, only Luke is with me. One of the sad realities of life is people are going to come into our lives. Some of them are going to stay. Some of them are going to go. Demas came in, and he left. He didn't stick around. And that was sad, and you could tell that that hurt Paul. But thank God for Luke. And he was thankful for Luke and the faithful companion that he had in Luke. And I know we went through those last couple really, really quickly. Ananias, an unknown preacher, except that he baptized one of the great missionaries of all time. Barnabas, he was just a church leader, except he encouraged and motivated that great missionary, changed his life. Aquila and Priscilla, just humble tent makers. But what they did and the hospitality they showed made a difference in the life of Paul. Apollos, hey, he was willing to do what was asked. He was a powerful preacher, willing to learn, willing to show humility. And you had Luke, who was a faithful companion of Paul, made a difference in his life. These people that we think of maybe as being in the shadows, they don't need to be in the shadows. They're people that we can learn from. They were humble servants and certainly made a difference in the church, and still people that we can learn from today. So again, I apologize I ran through that at the end very quickly. Any comments? There's little girls and boys at the door, so thank y'all for your comments and for being with us tonight.